Okay, we're continuing in siman lamed bet. A lot of these seifim now are things that we studied very much in depth in Ilchot Sefer Torah. So obviously we'll review them again, but I'll try to do them just a bit more quickly and focus on the things that are unique to Ilchot Tefillin. Okay, so the first one we have is in Seif Zayin. This is one of my favorite topics. Remember, we dealt with this at length at the beginning of Ilchot Sefer Torah. So the Mechaber says, "Halacha leMoshe b'Sinai, tefillin al haklaf, velo al haduchsustus velo al hagvil." Right. So if you remember, in Chazal they have three types of klafim: klaf, duchsustus, and gvil. Gvil, everybody agrees that that's when you keep the skin of the animal complete. You don't separate it. Okay, so that's gvil. So that everybody agrees upon. Klaf and duchsustus are you separate the gvil into two parts, right? If you remember, I think I showed you at the time that the skin of the animal is divided into two layers. There's the thin outer layer, which is called the epidermis, and there's the inner thicker layer of the skin, which is called the dermis. And those two are separable. In other words, at least it depends how you tan the leather, but at least in the old way that they tan the leather with afatzim, with gall, then those two were separable. But there's a machlokit rishonim how to identify which one of these two. In other words, is the outer layer the klaf and the inner layer the duchsustus, or is it the other way around, that the outer layer is the duchsustus and the inner one is the klaf? Now, this is particularly important by tefillin as opposed to Sefer Torah. Why? Because Sefer Torah you can write on gvil, okay? So no problem, okay? Sefer Torah, we write on gvil and then we could, it's not exactly what is done, but in theory, we could write on gvil and avoid the whole machloket. The problem is, as the Mechaber here says, that tefillin have to be specifically done al haklaf velo al duchsustus velo al gvil. By the way, mezuzah, also we have less of a problem. Why? Because mezuzah, we can write on duchsustus or on klaf. So miman of shach, whichever one it is, we could be kasher. Tefillin we're the most stuck with. Why? Because tefillin they have to be specifically on klaf, not duchsustus and not gvil. Okay, so let's see how the Mechaber rules, and then I'll address the other shitot in the Rishonim. So the Mechaber rules: kotvina laklaf b'mkom basar, v'im shina pasul. In other words, the Gemara says that you write on klaf mekom basar. In other words, because the skin has two sides to it. One side is called mekom se'ar. In other words, the one that's facing out of the animal, where the hair grows out, and mekom basar is the side of the klaf facing the inner part of the animal. So the Gemara says kotvina laklaf b'mkom basar. Okay. V'im shina pasul, and if you write on the other side, then it's pasul. Now here's the big question: Ma'u klaf u'ma'u duchsustus? Which one is which? Right, as we said, when you tan the leather, you can separate the ore into two parts. וחלק החיצון, שהוא לצד השיער, נקרא klaf. In other words, the Mechaber rules that the outer part, in other words, what I said, the epidermis, the outer part, which is actually the thinner layer, is called klaf. והפנימי הדבוק לבשר נקרא duchsustus. And the inner part, which is the inner part which is attached to the flesh of the animal, that's called duchsustus, right? This is the shita of Tosfot that the Mechaber is saying that duchsustus is the inner part, because Tosfot explained that duchsustus means flesh, basar, and that's why they understood that the inner part of the klaf is the duchsustus. So what does it mean that we write on the klaf b'mkom basar? The klaf is not attached to the basar. According to this opinion, it's the outer part of the klaf. So he says, היינו במקום היותר קרוב לבשר. דהיינו במקום חיבורו כשהוא דבוק לדוכסוסטוס. In other words, according to this opinion, since the klaf is the outer part, and that's not really touching the basar at all, so what it means במקום basar, it means the inner side facing towards the basar. Okay? וקלפים שלנו, שאין חולקים אותם. So now the problem is, according to the Mechaber, our klafim, in other words, this is what we spoke about at the time, that the original method in Chazal of tanning the leather was using afatzim, using gall, what you can take from the tree bark. But at some point, they changed the meshet. I mean, Jews weren't involved in tanning leathers. It was done by goyim, which is another problem. How do you do ibud lishma if a goy is doing the ibud? But they used to use seed, ibud beseed. And the method when you do ibud beseed does not allow you to separate the klaf into the two parts. So he says, klafim shelanu she'ein cholkim otam, yesh laim din klaf, right? This is the sheet of Tosfot, Rabbeinu Tam, that our klafim have the status of klaf. V'chotvim alehem letzad basar, and you write on the side of their klaf, which is facing towards the flesh, שמה שמגררים קליפתו העליונה שבמקום שיער, אינו אלא כדי מה שצריך לתקנו ולהחליקו. ואפילו אם היו חולקים האור לשניים, היה צריך לגרן ממנו כך. ומצד הבשר גוררים הרבה עד שאין נשאר אלא הקלף בלבד. In other words, what he's saying here is as follows. Now really in our klafim, we don't separate anything into two, but instead what we do is we take off layers from both sides. Okay? So it's not really klaf and it's not really duchsustus, right? Because we're not separating the klaf and the duchsustus into two. Rather, we have one piece, but we take off from both sides of it. So the Mechaber says the way you should do it is take off a little bit from, because again, really the klaf should be the outer part, according to the Shita, right? So, but you're taking off from both sides. So what are you doing? So he says you should take off from the outer part just a little bit, just the klipa elyona shebemkom se'ar. You know, that's just to make it a bit smooth so that you'll be able to use it. And mitzad basar, there you should take off much more because that's the inner part, according to this shita, is the duchsustus. So you need to remove all of that duchsustus, and whatever you're left with, that's considered the klaf. Okay? So that's the shita of the Mechaber. Okay, who is cholik on this? The other shita in the Rishonim that's cholik on this is the Rambam. Okay, the Rambam held just the opposite, that the duchsustus is the outer layer, okay, and the klaf is the inner layer, okay? In other words, the duchsustus, according to the Rambam, that's the epidermis, okay? That's the thin outer layer, and the klaf is the inner layer, the thicker inner layer, the dermis. Okay, now that makes more sense when the Gemara says, Kotvim ala klaf b'makom basar. According to the Rambam, it's simpler, because the klaf, which is the inner layer, is the actual part touching the flesh. Okay, so according to the Rambam, when it says, as opposed to the sheet of Tosfot, the klaf is the outer layer. So when it says klaf b'makom basar, it's a bit difficult because the klaf is not touching the basar. So Tosfot said it's the side facing towards the basar. According to the Rambam, it's easier because the klaf is the inner layer, which is actually touching the basar, and that's there you write there on the klaf b'makom basar. Okay. Now, if you look here in the Orach, he says here, right? Because again, you're taking off from the outer layer, okay? And according to the Mechaber, dafka, the outer layer is the klaf. According to the Rambam, it's fine that you're taking off the outer layer because actually you need the inner part. But according to the Mechaber rules like Tosfot, you shouldn't take off the outer layer. So he says just to take off a little bit. So you can see here in the Orach, he says, "V'im gered yoter mizayen b'nishmat adam de'ato de'lo nikritu klaf b'chatam sofer mashma shemekel b'zeh." In other words, the Chayei Adam, he was concerned that if you would take off too much, then that wouldn't be considered klaf anymore. However, he brings here the Chatam Sofer who's lenient on this. Let's see what else is there in the Orach. Yeah, okay. So that's that. So just an interesting point that I'll share with you that I just clarified now before the shiur. So basically, I'll just show you something. After we studied Ilchot Sefer Torah about the whole business of ibud ba'afotzim, or as opposed to ibud beseed, so my wife got wind of it, and she bought me a present, a Megillat Esther written on Gvil, on Klaf Mu'bad Ba'afotzim. I'll just show you. Here, I have it here. Like a, sometimes when you have Gvil, it's you can't really see too much, but it's like a thick klaf. It's much thicker than the the normal klafim that we have, because Gvil, when you do the afotzim, then you really have the complete klaf. And also, it can actually be separated into two sections. In other words, what we have, like the standard clef, which most people use, which is mubad besid, you can't separate from both sections. So you take off layers from here, take off layers from there, and the Bala Tosfot said it's kasher. But according to the, if you do it the older way, like it was in the times of Chazal, you can actually separate into two, into klaf and into duchsustus. So I asked the sofer who wrote this Megillat Esther, I just called him up this morning, and I asked him because I know he follows, for everything, Ibud Bafasim. So I asked him, what do you do by tefillin? In other words, Sefer Torah, Megillat Esther, no problem, you write on Gvil. But what do you do regarding tefillin? Because here you're stuck. Either you follow Tosfot or you follow the Rambam. So he said to me that he follows the Rambam. And in other words, he separates the klaf, I don't know if himself or the people who deal with this, who make the leather, they separate it into two. And they use the inner part, which is the klaf according to the Rambam, not the outer part, which according to the Rambam is duchsustus, and it's not like shitat Tosfot, and not like the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. So I asked him, what's the justification for that? So he said as follows, and he shared with me a very interesting article that made this claim. And the claim there is as follows. First of all, he wants to follow the Rambam. Okay, very nice, legitimate. It's legitimate following the Rambam, especially since the Rambam seems to here to be a more pshat in the Gemara. But secondly, he said that practically speaking, even the minhag that the Shulchan Aruch describes, that you take off just a little bit of the outer layer and more of the inner layer, lemaise, you've removed the epidermis, okay? Because the epidermis is very, very thin. So even that little bit that the Shulchan Aruch says that you can remove, and it's not a problem to remove that, lemaise, you've removed the epidermis. So before, the minhag has always been to write on the, even though, Balei Tosfot and other Rishonim said that it's kasher and that it's klaf, lemaise, technically speaking, what you do right, what everybody writes on nowadays is more the inner part of the klaf, which is actually the sheet of the Rambam, that's the klaf. So therefore, he says, based on that, even the minhag, even though again the Rishonim, everybody justified that minhag according to their shita, but nevertheless, before the minhag has always been like the Rambam, that we use the inner part of the, again, putting aside the question of how you do the ibud, but the actual part of the klaf which is used is more the inner part, and because the outer part of the epidermis is very, very thin and it just comes off right away when you do the when they do the the process of cutting down from both sides of the layer. So Lemaise, he says de facto the minhag, and he shared with me an article by somebody by the name of Rav Yosef Cohen, who made this claim already 20-30 years ago. So the Lemaise, the minhag has always been like the Rambam, that the inner part is the klaf. So based on that, that's what that's how he told me he did his feeding. Okay. All right, so that was very interesting, I thought. Okay.
Can I ask, is there any, maybe here we can ask linguists, what actually the word duchsustus sounds like a Greek word, whether they have any claim what the original Greek word would have meant.
Yes, I think I actually looked into that last time. Let me see if I have
on the side, the Orach, on the pages that you shared with us on the screen, where he tried to I assume that when the Mishnah Berurah assigns the Makor, he uses the Orach as a dictionary, but I'm not sure.
Right. Well, Tosfot claimed that duchsustus linguistically means basal, and that's why they here I have the Aruch actually. Let me share it on the screen. Also said that basar is from sustus, okay, but he said that that's a mistake. He says here, Omer Rabbeinu Tam. I think this is not the Aruch himself. This is a commentary on the Aruch, but he wrote האומר לרבינו תם שבלשון לבני קוראים לבשר סוסטוס כיחש לו. That whoever told the Balei Tosfot that that's what the sustus means is mistaken. Rather, what he claims here, this is an edition called the Aruch HaLashas, which is basically, you know, the book of the Aruch has several layers to it. There's the original Aruch, and then there was somebody who added later on, I forget the name, many comments on it. And this edition is taking the Aruch and putting it, instead of in the order of the Aleph Bet, just on the order of the Dapim on Shas. So here he claims, and you can see it in the notes of the sides just clearly, in this nice edition, he says, Bivanit dichsistus lachtzot leshnayim. Okay? Right, like do. Do, I guess, is two, or D, and sechistos, I guess, is takat, if I'm understanding correctly. So according to this, duchsusus just means that it's cut into two. So therefore, it's not necessarily the one which is towards the inner part, or towards the flesh. So that's the basic for the Rambam, that duchsustus is the outer one.
So maybe that actually makes a lot of sense, because if you say that the duchsustus, you can also, the outer ring, what you call the epidermis, you can take off more layers. So you could say that you have the inner one that is one, and you have the outer one that is still again separable to two, like cut to two. So then therefore the epidermis, the thicker epidermis is considered duchsustus, because that's still separable for two.
No, it's the other way around. The epidermis is thinner. The epidermis is the thinner one. The dermis.
You said that the epidermis, we still remove one layer for where the hair was attached to. So that means even the epidermis is multi-layered.
No, I'm saying that's the way the Mechaber described it. The Mechaber described it as if I'm just removing the parts of the hair, but I'm still, whatever I'm left with is still considered his shita, that it's klaf, that's considered
the outer one.
Yeah, but I'm saying lemaise, at least from what I was told, what happens is when they remove that, in essence, they remove the entire epidermis. It's not like the Mechaber is describing that I'm left with something. In other words, it could be the Mechaber didn't follow epidermis versus dermis, but that's sort of our lashon, based on the science. But lemaise, the two layers that are clearly separable are the epidermis and the dermis. And when they've removed, even though the Mechaber calls it just to remove the part that's attached to the seif, since it's so thin, then lemaise it's removed. Again, by the way, just again to remind you, the logic of the Rambam, I think we spoke about it at the time, is as follows: that Sefer Torah has the highest kedusha, so that's why it has gevil, which is the thickest part. Tefillin have the middle kedusha, so that gets klaf, which again, according to the Rambam, is the dermis, which is the thicker one. And mezuzah is duchsustus, which is the thinner one, because mezuzah is the lowest kedusha of the three. So that's sort of the sheet of the Rambam is, is very coherent. It makes a lot of sense in all these aspects. Okay, so in other words, basically what he was claiming is that you can follow the Rambam, and lemaise de facto, even though Tosfot didn't understand that way, practically the minhag has always been, at least in this regard, like the Rambam. That was his claim. Okay, we'll see. Maybe when we finish Hilchot Tefillin, I'll get myself a new pair. But for now, I'm staying with. Okay, let's keep going. Okay. So seif chet now gets into the ibud. So he says, tzarich laklaf liot meubad ba'afatzim o besid. Again, this was also the big machloket. The Rambam claimed that all our klafim, which are meubad besid, they're all pasul. It's not kasher, not for Sefer Torah, not for tefillin. But all the other Rishonim said no, that ibud besid is also kasher, and that's been the minhag, at least till. Like I said, nowadays some people have started making again klaf meubad ba'afatzim, and I think the Yemenites. Even the Yemenites, I think even though they did have gevil and meubad ba'afatzim, I think they also use seed. I don't think they completely followed the Rambam on this point. At least that's what somebody told me. Nowadays you have people that are doing now klaf again meubad ba'afatzim, but to follow the Rambam. But again, the minhag, at least for the past 1,000 years, has been to use seed.
Maybe if I might be able to add something, I just Googled thickness epidermis cow.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a study here which suggested that it really depends also on the area in the world where the cattle is from. Like the warmer it gets, the thinner the skin gets.
Oh,
so that might also maybe explain what of the difference between the Rambam and Balatoisis.
That they had a thicker cattle, you mean?
Yes.
Ah, very interesting. It sounds like something evolutionary, that it would be
Yeah,
thinner.
I mean, it makes sense that in an area where it's very hot that you have a thinner skin.
Okay,
no, other way around. That in a colder climate, it's better to have a thicker skin.
Yes,
because of the cold.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. So it could be that their whole cloth was thicker.
Yeah. So like the average thickness, also depending where on the body, is about 4.2 millimeters in cold regions and average 3.1 in hot regions.
That's just for the epidermis?
Yes, and enough for the skin in total.
Oh, in total, both the epidermis and the dermis.
Yes.
Okay. But the epidermis is clearly the thinner one out of the two. I think you can see
yes.
that. You can see that in the pictures. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the Mechaber rules again, like most Rishonim, that also besid is kasher. So that's what he said. Tzrich liyot meubad b'afitzim o besid. V'tzarich sheyeh meubad lishmo. Right. We require ibud lishma. There actually is one shita that by tefillin we do not have to have ibud lishma. In other words, the Gemara is clear that on Sefer Torah you need ibud lishma. By tefillin, the Mechaber rules that also Rambam, many Rishonim hold that you also need ibud lishma. Although I think there is a minority shita in the Rishonim, which the Mishnah Berurah mentions that you don't need ibud lishma by tefillin. And he says, Tov leotzi besfatav בתחילת העיבוד שהוא מעבדו לשם תפילין או לשם ספר תורה. אבל אם עיבדה לשם מזוזה, פסול. Okay, so first of all, there are a few things here in the Mechaber that we see. First of all, he says, Tov leotzi besfatav. Again, this is a safek which the Sefer HaTruma raised when a general safek in halacha, not just by the Sefer Torah Tefillin, by writing a get, by afiyat matzah, whatever it is that we need to do lishma, is it enough? Is it just enough to have b'machshava, or you actually have to say it b'peh, right? The lishma. So the Mechaber rules tov leotzi besfatav, mashma that it's lechatchila you should say it. Harei ani me'abed et ha'or l'shem kedushat, whatever. But here, as the Mishnah Berurah rules, he says ubediavad dayo b'machshava, and even what you do is only batchila. Right here, as the Mishnah Berurah says, ויותר אין צריך לא להוציא בשפתיו ולא לחשוב. שמאבדים לשמה אלא בתחילתו בלבד, ואפילו נמשך העיבוד כמה ימים, דכל העושה על דעת הראשונה עושה. In other words, once you had the correct מחשבה, and preferably also the אמירה בפה, אבל לשמה, then everything that follows from that is also considered לשמה, because whatever you're doing, even though you're not now all you're thinking about is, I don't know, something else, other things that you have in mind, it's all על דעת הראשונה הוא עושה. Okay? And he says here, now here, the Mechaber says that you have to be ma'abed l'shem tefillin or l'shem sefer Torah, אבל אם עיבדה l'shem mezuzah pasul. Why? Because if you did the ibud l'shem mezuzah, then mezuzah has a lower kedusha. So therefore, a klav that you did the ibud l'shem mezuzah, you can't use for tefillin. But if you did, let's say, ibud l'shem sefer Torah, which has a higher kedusha than tefillin, then you can still use that klav for tefillin. Okay, that's what the Mishnah Berurah here writes. He says, "Kedushatah chamura mitfilin, ubechlal matay maneh." In other words, when you have kavanah lekedusha l'shem sefer Torah, included in that is kavanah lekedushat tefillin, because kedushat sefer Torah is a higher kedusha, which includes already the kedusha of tefillin. ואף על פי כן מותר לשנות לתפילין ומזוזות, אף דקדושתם קלה ממנו. But nevertheless, I can still now say it, even though I was ma'abed the or for sefer Torah, it hasn't yet become a sefer Torah, so therefore I can now say I'll use it for tefillin or mezuzot. But I'm not allowed to change it for a דבר חול, because I was sort of already מקדיש it. אם ניתנה בפירוש בתחילת עיבודן שיהיה מותר לשנתו אף לדבר חול, אז מותר לשנתו, unless I made the תנאי that I could even change it to use it for חול purposes. והנכון שינהגו כן הסופרים לכתחילה, בעת שמשימים האורות לתוך הסיד, שיאמרו אני נותן אורות אלו לתוך הסיד, לשם קדושת ספר תורה, ואני מתנה לה שארצה שאוכל לשנתו לכל דבר. ולא כמו שנהגו הסופרים שאומרים לשם ספר תורה, או תפילין, או מזוזות, או שאר דבר רשות, ואז מסתפקים האחרונים ממהני ועיין בביאור הלכה. In other words, he says, some say that you can say I'm doing it לשם ספר תורה או תפילין או מזוזות. So the Mishnah Berurah says that's no good, because then it's like אין ברירה, right? We don't know, so which one is it? So he says better to do it לשם קדושת ספר תורה, and to just make a t'nai that I'll be able to use it for any other purpose that I want. He has here he says ולא מהני רק למזוזה בלבד, אם איבד לתפילין מהני אף למזוזה ולא לספר תורה. I did see some that say it's better to just do the לשם תפילין for לשם תפילין, לשם ספר תורה, לשם ספר תורה. But the Mishnah Berurah says it's also fine if you do it לשם קדושת ספר תורה, just make a t'nai that you'll be able to use it also for other purposes as well. But לשם קדושת ספר תורה includes everything. Here he says, let's say I forgot to have the kavanah lishma. So he says here in the Bi'ur Halacha, it says here, היוצא מדברנו, דאם שכח ליתן האורod לתוך הסיד לשמה, because again, that's the first process of tanning the leather of the ibud, when you put it to soak in the seed. So he says, so אם שכח ליתן האורod לתוך הסיד לשמה, ונזכר בתוך עיבודו, בעוד שיש עליה עדיין שם דיפטרה. In other words, diftera is an clef that did not undergo the process of ibud. So if I put it in the seed, I forgot to have kavanah lishma, but it's still in the process. The process hasn't been completed yet. She says, שיתלם מן הסיד ויחזור ויתנם לתוך הסיד לשמה, כן נראה לי ברור בעזרת השם יתברך. So he says, then you can take it out and put it back in, because he says as long as the completion of the ibud was done lishma, then that's fine. Here it says the reason is the Rabbanan. Okay, let's see quickly one more seif in the last 2 minutes. אם עבדו אינו יהודי, לרמב"ם פסול, אפילו אמר לו ישראל לאבד לשמו. ולהראש כשר אם ישראל עומד על גביו ושיאו, הגזרה קצת בעבודה. Okay? וכן נוהגים, ועיין ליה. Okay, this was a big problem in the times of the Rishonim, that there were no Jews that worked in tanning leathers. It was all done by Goyim. Now the problem is, as we said, you have to do the ibud lishma. So we know that by a get, so the Rambam says it doesn't work. Okay, if the Einu Yehudi does the ibud, even if you tell him do it l'shem kedushat sefer Torah, it doesn't help. And a goy cannot do something lishma. Now, what's the source for the Rambam? The source for the Rambam is that the Gemara says by writing a get, that again you have to write a get lishma. So the Gemara says that even if you have what we call Yisrael Gadol Omed El Gabav, right? You have a Gadol Yisrael instructing the goy to write the get lishma on the Torah part of the get, which is the part that needs lishma deoraita. That doesn't work. Why? Because the Gemara says goya daita denafshe avi. In other words, even if you tell him to do something lishma, he has his own ideas in his mind, and it's not considered that he's writing lishma. The Rosh says that there is a difference between writing a get and ibud. Why? Because he says writing a get is a long process, and you need to have the proper kavanah throughout. The guy, he doesn't have the proper kavanah throughout. But the ibud, since it's just to get the process started, to do something very simple, to put the leather into the seed, so for that, if the Yisrael stands above the goy and tells him to do it lishma, there Yisrael Gadol Omed El Gabav works, and that is considered ibud lishma. So according to the Rosh, just the fact that the Yisrael is telling him to do it lishma, and standing over the goy and instructing him to do it lishma, that is considered lishma, even though the goy is doing it. The Maaseh, what the Rishonim say, and this is what the Mechaber here rules, that we shouldn't just rely on that, but also the Yisrael should also do what we call v'si'o k'tzat ba'avodah. Even though he's not a leather tanner, so obviously he can't do the work himself, but he should do some sort of small action, and not just to rely on this rosh, the Gadol Omed El Gabav, but to do a little bit of a siyua as well, and that way Yisrael will be involved. So you can sort of have the Jew help out. Okay. However, here the Mishnah
Basically, like with Bishul Akum, basically.
one.
Basically, it's saying like with Bishul Akum that the Jew is like turning on the stove or something.
Yes, but by Bishul Akum, it makes more sense because Bishul Akum, you just need like a heker, right? It's a Durabanan issue, so you just need like a heker that the Jew is involved. Here, you're trying to turn it into Lishma, like a Doraita halacha, so it's more severe. But again, according to the Rosh, the fact that you have the Israel that's enough already to make Lishma. Here too, also, the Siyua works like a Chumrah. So he says, that's what here the Mishnah Berurah says, אפילו אם לא סיוע רק בסוף העיבוד, ואפילו אם גם זה הסיוע אלא רק בשו"ת עם עכו"ם כשר. בכל זה מצווה בעלמא, בדיעבד דרוש כשר אפילו לא סיוע הכלל, דעכו"ם הדייתא דישראל המצווה הוא לעשות לשמה אביד, וכן המנהג, והמנהג לפי דברי האחרונים, here the Mishnah says, what was the מנהג בפועל? והמנהג לפי דברי האחרונים לכתחילה צריך להיות כך שהשימה ישראל בעצמו האורות לתוך הסיב לשמה. ויאמר לעכו"ם שכל שאר מלאכת העבוד שיעשה הוא שיעשה גם כן לשמה. So the minhag was that the Jew would put it into the seed, because that's sort of the beginning of the process, and then everything else that the goy would need to do in the tanning of the leather, then for that we would rely on the Rosh, and in this way, at least we also had a proper maaseh of the Israel, and maybe we would be yotze the shita of the Rambam as well by doing this. Okay, I think nowadays, I haven't checked it, but I assume nowadays, you know, we don't rely on goyim anymore, and we actually have, you know, in the places that make klaf for Sefer Torah, they actually have Jews doing everything throughout, and then it's definitely kasher, you know, l'kuli alma, even according to the Rambam. All right, any questions or comments on this? All right, very good. Shkoyach to everyone.
Thank you.
Yeshiko, thank you so much. Have a great day. Shabbat.